Hello, everyone, and welcome to an addendum of the Makdisi Street podcast. I am Sadeh Makdisi, joined by my brothers Osama and Kareem, and we're all gathered today to talk about the repercussions of what's been happening to our most recent guest, Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, who has recently been suspended from her position as a professor at Hebrew University. We want to talk about that because part of what was used against Nadira in the university and in the Israeli media writ large was what she said in our podcast. And in looking at what comes up in the letter that was written to her, and of course also the media coverage discussing what she said, it's so clear to all of us. This is the first thing we want to begin with, is the extent to which lines from what she said were cherry picked carefully to try to present her in a particularly bad light. And a lot of the things that she said, which would complicate the picture they're trying to paint of her, are completely kind of overridden and overlooked in such a way again, just to basically to perform a kind of character assassination of her, in effect. We could talk about some of the specific cherry picking. I want to point out, for example, that Nadira said repeatedly about what happened on October 7th, "Not in my name," and that line she repeated two or three times in our discussion is nowhere mentioned in the coverage that of this sort of attack on her that's followed since then, which is particularly striking, of course. What I want to say on behalf of myself and my brothers, and I'm sure they join me in saying this, is that we, of course, stand completely in solidarity with Nadra. That it's outrageous for any academic or any human being, not just an academic, but especially an academic in this instance, to be suspended from their position for articulating not just particular intellectual point of view, but a point of view that is consistent with humanity, with reason, with peace, with equality and rights and justice, which is all the principles that Nadira so eminently stands for. And I think it says a lot about the institutions that are opposing her, that are incapable of recognizing not just her own humanity, but the humanity that she represents in the Palestinian cause that she was also speaking to, the principles of the Palestinian cause, which are, of course, primarily about justice and rights and equality. That's the first thing we want to say. And then, of course, to my mind, also, and I'm sure my brothers agree with me as well on this point, there's also the issue that comes up both in the letter written to her by her university and in the media coverage in the Israeli press. A lot of this has to do with denial, and this is really what we should spend some of our time talking about today, because the practice of denial, about which I've written a whole book about Zionism and denial, it's here in full force. It seems as though there's an incapacity on the part of Israelis and Zionists in general to recognize what it is that they are engaged in, what their project fundamentally represents, is a project of, from the beginning, from 1948 onwards, as a project of dispossession, ethnic cleansing, destruction, and now what we're seeing in Gaza, full-blown genocide. There seems to be an incapacity on their part to understand that, and of course to focus on that. That's the fundamental outrage that all of us should be talking about, rather than what Nadira herself said or didn't say. That the outrage before us is genocide. That's what we should be really talking about. And I think that it's still mind-boggling. Again, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but to me, it's mind-boggling that not just the state, forget the state, but that these civil society institutions within the state, the academic system, the journalism and so forth, there's this incredible incapacity to understand what the state is about, what the state is engaged in, what they themselves, therefore, as part of civil society, are complicit in, because they are complicit in, especially by trying to deny it and cover it up. They're complicit in the acts that the Israeli state is perpetrating, not just in the Gaza Strip, but has been perpetrating for 7 decades now to the Palestinian people writ large, the ones in the West Bank, the ones in Jerusalem, the ones in pre-48, and of course the Palestinians in exile as well. So with that in mind, as a few basic points, Osama, Kareem, what do you make of this event, and of course the syndrome of denial to which it also speaks?
Well, I'd like to say, I mean, if I could, I'd like to say, first of all, I agree with what Sari just said in terms of our standing in complete solidarity with Nadera. I mean, the reason, of course, they have been trying to shut her down long before this podcast, or the last podcast we had with her. In fact, going all the way back to October, and I'm sure long before October, is because Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian is not only a brilliant scholar, not only an extraordinarily courageous person, a Palestinian who lives surrounded by settlers, who is a voice of conscience, who's always a voice of humanity, who's always sort of talking about the details of what happens, the details of occupation, the details of colonization, the children, what she calls the unchilding. And of course, the idea that she's been subjected to this extraordinary campaign of defamation, and as you said, Sadi, cherry picking. I mean, what I was struck by in our conversation with her is how adamant she was to just not deny anything about October 7th. Her whole point was saying, "Not in my name." She said it several times, and she said, as a feminist, she said she doesn't need evidence of if a woman says. Remember, she said that at one point in our podcast. She said, if a woman says she's raped, she's raped. I don't need evidence, she said, as a feminist. In other words, she went far beyond in terms of just her ethical, feminist, anti-colonial position was extraordinarily and abundantly clear, and yet without compromise on the fundamental issue of the humanity and of the Palestinians, of the fact that the Israeli state is engaged in genocide. Her whole discussion of ashla, of the body parts, of the pieces, of the reconstitution of the Palestinian whole that has been fragmented both physically and metaphorically and politically and by the Israel and geographically by the Israeli state and by the Israeli state project, absolutely is and so there's that part, that total defamation of Nadira and all her humanity is one thing that all of us can see happening. But the second part, Sadi and Karim, is to say that this is part, of course, of a much wider, much broader campaign, not just of genocide in Gaza, but of the defamation of the Palestinians and all those who speak on behalf of Palestinians anywhere in the world of any faith. This is happening, of course, Nadira first and foremost right now. But remember, we've had Palestinian academics killed in Gaza, slaughtered, universities destroyed. There's been an entire campaign to silence Palestinians, to intimidate those who stand in solidarity with Palestinians. And this is yet another example of this. It's actually a scandal. Karim, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I want to echo what you guys are saying. And first of all, of course, also say that I'm in total solidarity, as we all are, with Nadira. And I agree precisely. I think, Sarah, you both said this idea of cherry picking, where they took things completely out of context and did not actually say what she actually said. As a feminist, as you're saying, as an anti-colonial scholar, all these things, as a humanist, and all these things were I thought, quite extraordinary. And this just simply needs to be said at the very top. I think it's also interesting as well to point to this sense of where they feel the victims again, where they feel besieged, where they're the ones who are somehow casting themselves as the ones who are being hurt. Whether it's on American college campuses with this business of, oh, you didn't invite me, or you didn't do this, and I'm uncomfortable this, I'm uncomfortable that, or in this university where, if I remember correctly, the statement they issued was that they're suspending Nadira because the welfare of students or something along these lines. And the sense of they're the ones who are the victims, they're the ones who are who we should be concerned about, rather than the Palestinians, or rather than human beings. Forget even Palestinians, but humans that have been under this genocide, under oppression, under occupation, under massive intimidation in all the parts of Palestine and outside of Palestine, including in Europe and including in America and other places where there's constant kind of crackdown and constant intimidation. Right. So I think this sense, we were talking earlier about sense of fragility, which kind of contrasts, I think, with this incredible military that they have in terms of bombing, not in terms of success, but in terms of the bombing and the destruction and the killing. And now they're talking about the ashlat, reducing things to body parts, and ashlat, not even unchilding, but it's just ashlat itself. And so all this kind of big things, and then when it comes down to it, there's this sense of absolute fragility to the Zionist project itself, and this I think expresses in both of this at the same time. So I think I think it's important as well to point that out.
No, just this, as Karim was saying, this point about fragility and this point about fear, and they use the idea Nadira is Palestinian. Nadira is living under settler colonialism. Nadira is living surrounded by settlers. Nadira is speaking out at a time when the Palestinians in Gaza are facing genocide and are being subjected to genocide, when they've been obliterated for how many months now? Is it 5 months? I think we're now in the fifth month, 161 days of this extraordinary slaughter. Just this morning, I woke up, Karim, I'm sure you're a little later than us, but to the news of yet another massacre of yet more Palestinians who are desperate for food, who are being starved in 2024. I mean, all the actual horrors of the reality of what's going on, and yet they have the gumption to claim that Nadira is the one who threatens the well-being of students when she is a voice of conscience in this. She's a voice of humanity and of justice in a university that appears to be, like all these other Zionist institutions, singularly hostile to Palestinian liberation, and is in total denial of the Palestinian narrative, as well as of Palestinian history. So, Sadi, I don't know if you want to add to this,
Yeah.
but
No, and Palestinian personhood too, which is also what Nadera represents. I mean, so many of the cases that Nadera was talking about in our discussion with her, but in her work, her scholarship in general, has to do with the personhood with Palestinians as human beings, even as individual human beings, of course, as a collective too. And that the discussion of ashla, a lot the body parts or dismembering, whether of individual human bodies or the Palestinian body politic as a whole, that's all. It's all about the rehumanizing the Palestinians who've been so systematically dehumanized by Zionism for the past 70 for 7 decades or more. But then she went on to say that why is it any surprise that the Israeli state lies? This is what they do, and to see the shock in these Israeli responses to what she's saying, that she said we lie. I mean, to think, how can you not know that your state has been lying for 7 decades? It lied in 1948 when it said that Palestinians simply got up and ran away in 1948, as opposed to were driven from their homes in terror by racist gangs. The extent to which the Israeli state and its various arms engage in lying and obfuscation and denial and so forth. This is, I mean, it's like we could write encyclopedias about how much that state lies. It's not unique in that. I mean, many states lie, but the depth of it and the persistence of it in the face of overwhelming evidence is something that is remarkable about the Israeli state. So this is, again, it goes back to this incapacity, or I think Karim used the word, fragility, the brittleness of the Zionist narrative to stand up to scrutiny. It's incapable of dealing with reality, and it's incapable of standing up to pressure and scrutiny. So its sole reaction is to lash out in anger and frustration, which is what the Israeli army does in the streets of Gaza, and obviously what Israeli civil society institutions do and Zionist institutions do in general, is to lash out blindly, to censor, to blacklist, to block, to deny, to scream, to shout, to claim, to engage in various forms of emotional blackmail, and that's basically what they're reduced to.
Yeah, I want to ask you guys. I mean, in terms of, we were talking earlier about our solidarity, and I think there've been a lot of expressions of solidarity with Nadira, which are to Nadira personally, but also the principle, of course, beyond this. So, I mean, in where you guys are in the U.S. and North America and in Europe, what kind of expressions of solidarity has there been? Have they come out a lot? The associations, the institutions, or
what I would say is that there have been expressions I think there have been expressions of solidarity with Nadira, of course, and because Nadira has like a significant following among in academic circles, as well as anyone who's ethically involved with Palestine, who understands the power of her testimony and her witness, and in addition to her writing and her scholarship, it's just her witness, her ability to stand up, to speak clearly about the profound injustice in details, and that's what that makes Nadira stand out, is that the power of her presentations, and the Zionists obviously have an unbelievably difficult time with that kind of witness and testimony. But Karim, on the larger part, I mean, I've said this several times already. The American Historical Association, to which I have belonged, for decades, the idea of this association, which has yet until now, despite the destruction of several Palestinian universities in Gaza, the obliteration, in fact, of universities, the killing of university professors, the killing of university rectors, the killing of students, the destruction of student life in Gaza, at a university level, the destruction of archives, the destruction of libraries, all these things, cultural centers, not a word as of now, as of that I'm aware of, not a single word from the American Historical Association, not one word. And that to me is one of the great scandals of our time, because of course the American Historical Association took a very strong stand about the Russian invasion of Ukraine within weeks, I think, or even days of the Russian invasion. They immediately took a stand denouncing Russia and Putin and so on and so forth on Gaza, despite the genocide, despite the horror, despite the fact that we've all seen this. They've said nothing, total denial. And the same, I think, goes institutionally across this country. There is a complete, I think, denial of the sheer, not just the genocide, but the destruction, the academic, what scholars are calling the scholasticide, the destruction of scholarly sort of institutions, of life, of the ability of Palestinians to learn, to teach, to even have institutions, universities, all demolished. And again, it's not hidden; it's right there and overt. So, I think the persecution of Nadera, which of course is persecution at an individual level, is part and parcel of this wider attempt to destroy Palestinian academic, intellectual, cultural life, which of course is part and parcel of the genocide.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're dealing with here. This is it, and it also shows the extent to which Israeli academic institutions are involved in not just in this particular instance of genocide, but in covering for it and in aiding and abetting in various ways, which have been well documented by recent books and other recent scholarship. Um, are heavily involved in the perpetuation of the occupation inside the 67 territories, in the maintenance and support of the system of apartheid that is maintained wherever the Israeli state has power, which means pre 48 and 67, and then basically everywhere where Israel has power. And of course, it brings us inevitably to the question of, why have there been calls for a boycott of these institutions? It's interesting, by the way, in the letter that her university sent to her, in which it suspended her, the Hebrew University announces itself as a proud Zionist institution, which I thought was particularly striking, because I thought universities aren't supposed to have ideological programs, right? Because obviously what that's saying is, if you're a Zionist, you could belong to this institution, and if you're not a Zionist, or if you're critical of Zionism, then you have no place here. I mean, in other words, in that sense, the university, and this is supposedly one of the most liberal institutions in that state, right? So even the most liberal institution in the state is identifying as identifying itself fully as part of the larger state program and the state ideology, which is Zionism. And so, I mean, I don't know what more evidence people need in order to understand the drive for boycott. For me, this is just further evidence of the need for a systematic campaign of institutional academic boycotts. And we could talk about this, and we will in future episodes as well. Sports boycotts, cultural boycott more generally, obviously trade and economic boycott, full spectrum boycott, basically, because that is, as was the case with South Africa, that has a proven track record of helping to bring about real and substantial change in the cause of justice.
Yeah, and also, Sadi, just to go back to the point you were making earlier about the cherry picking, what's amazing to me is the way in which there is just an inability to ever allow, again, which is part of what's happening to Nadira, and is an inability to allow Palestinians to narrate, an inability to give the Palestinians the space to say, here's what we are saying, and to even have an ability to listen to what they're saying. It's this constant refusal that goes back decades and decades, as you said. This constant inability and refusal and rejection of allowing Palestinians to say, and then to listen, not even to be able to listen to what Palestinians are saying, to then take out of context not only what they're saying deliberately and cynically, but also, as Karim was saying, this goes back to this fragility question. When we say liberation, they hear something else completely. It's incredible to me. That's what I find astonishing, and that's what I think we need to figure out a little bit more and to think about a little bit more. But I think we should at some point, Karim, I don't know if you want to jump in here, but at some point, I mean, obviously we're all, and again, to reiterate the basic point of what we're doing here today, which is to say, we fundamentally, obviously stand in solidarity with Nadira. She doesn't even need our solidarity. But we fundamentally stand in solidarity with Nadera. We completely and utterly reject this disgraceful cherry picking and persecution of her words, and of her as person. And ultimately, we're part of what seems to me a much broader attempt and an insistence to provide witness to those who have been voiceless and repressed and suppressed. Karim, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we agree, and I think we're all kind of feeling the same thing. And I want to add just one last thing, which is this question. So we talked about fragility, we've talked about our solidarity and people's solidarity in general, and Nadira herself had talked about love. And in earlier episode, Ghassan Abu Sitta also talked about love as an antidote to Zionism. I like to come back to that. I mean, I think I've mentioned this before, but this notion of love as an antidote to Zionism, this notion of strength, as opposed to this fragile but extremely sort of this militant kind of entity that is committing all these atrocious kind of war crimes. But there's also the question of distraction. I mean, these things, as the defunding of UNRWA right after the ICJ genocide case, the provisional ruling, the defunding happened, and now, by the way, you may have read. All these states and the Canadians and the Danes and all these people are now coming back and providing the same aid back to UNRWA, which we kind of knew was going to happen. That whole thing was done as a kind of orchestrated attempt to distract from what's going on in Palestine, in Gaza, and to kind of move away from the ICJ. And they did all these threats, and they were always going to bring it back, because in the end, they had to kind of do this kind of thing after admitting that they hadn't even seen any evidence. And of course, there wasn't any evidence anyway. So this notion of distraction here again, them making this whole story where they become the victims and they become the ones who are under siege, and they're the one becomes who are unable to deal with this world that's out to get them, and they feel uncomfortable, when in reality they're the ones who are committing actual crimes and committing actual repression and suppression of academic thought, and of this, as you're saying, kind of a persecution of individuals, but also the collective. So I think these are important things that I'm sure we'll come back to in other episodes.
I think we can stop there and send again one last time our solidarity to Nadira, which she doesn't even really need.
And love to Nadira.